Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, March the 9th, as this podcast is being recorded. A barrel of Brent crude oil is trading at $109, having peaked overnight at $119. To put that in context, a month ago, it was $69 a barrel. It now is all but inevitable that in the coming weeks and months, the price of almost everything will rise once again, like it did in 2022 after the initial invasion of Ukraine. This is a major challenge to this and every government, particularly one already concerned about the cost of living. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Earlier, Donald Trump said only fools would fail to see the rise in oil prices as just a small price to pay for peace in the Middle East. In a social media post shortly after oil markets opened, he said short-term oil prices, which will drop rapidly when the destruction of the Iran nuclear threat is over, is a very small price to pay for the USA, for the world, safety and peace. But that price falls heavily on consumers.
It certainly does. Look, this is going to be a huge domestic problem, but given its trigger is the effective ongoing closure of the Straits of Hormuz and the fact that we can all see refineries on fire. Bahrain's energy company in the last few moments has just declared a force majeure, meaning it'll cease much of its operations. That all means that in the first instance, this requires global solutions. And there we will find out whether the rest of the American government is in sync with Trump's reaction through the actions of other US officials today.
Later today at about 1:30 UK time, G7 finance ministers, including Rachel Reeves, will hold an emergency meeting. The FT reporting that they will discuss a possible joint release of petroleum from reserves coordinated by the International Energy Agency, an idea that is backed by three countries, including America.
I think that's the reason for the slight rally, economic rally, and the slight drop overnight in the oil price. But let's see what happens. Since the US and Israel launched this war without endgame 10 days ago, it seems like the absolutely catastrophic potential impact on the global economy, including on America, is the only thing that could pare it back in the coming days. I was very struck by an interview in the FT on Friday with Qatar's energy minister, Saad Al-Kaabi, who warned that the war could bring down the economies of the world and predicted Gulf energy exporters would stop production within days, which looks pretty much like what's happening.
All of this as Iran seeks to present a seamless transition of power, naming the son of the late Ayatollah Khamenei as its new supreme leader. Mojtaba Khamenei won a decisive vote in Iran's Assembly of Experts, the semi-official Fars news agency reported. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, one of the country's most powerful and feared organizations, pledging full obedience to the new leader in a statement, but a lot of analysts saying that it really puts the IRGC more firmly in charge of the direction of the conflict and of the country.
Fascinating. We'll look at the more domestic implications in a moment, but just taking a slight step back and looking at it from a sort of global point of view, there are those, Anne, and for instance, former Chancellor George Osborne, I think, is amongst them, who see this conflict like the action Trump took in Venezuela in the sort of broader context of where this leaves the relative geopolitical might of the US versus China. And so on that score, how does China deal with an oil price spike? Well, I was very struck by a line at the bottom of the FT main story, which says that China, which isn't a full member of the IEA, has vast oil reserves, which it's built up over the last 12 months, something between 1.1, 1.4 billion barrels of oil. That means that if there's constriction of supply, which is what's happening at the moment, they have about 140 days of domestic oil import demand in their own strategic reserves, which is sort of quite a buffer. Now, I don't have an oil figure for the UK, but by contrast, Britain has just 2 days worth of gas storage. So some Western countries have not very much. China has a lot, and that will help them, I think, in the coming days, just as the other countries really, really struggle, I think.
To summarise some other UK-specific developments here, last night the MOD announced that the UK had shot down an Iranian drone as part of defensive sorties by RAF Typhoons and F-35s in the region, with a Merlin helicopter due there too. It can fly a mile high and give warning of drones that should arrive very soon. On Saturday, Sky and others reporting that the UK's aircraft carrier, the Prince of Wales, was put on notice and its time to deployment countdown was cut in half to 5 days, making it easier for the PM to send it to the region quickly, although no final decision seems to have been taken by this morning. Playbook also hearing it sounds like the Defence Secretary John Healey will give a statement to the Commons on the situation in the Middle East this afternoon, sometime around or after 3:30.
I think there are lots of MPs who want to make the Commons the centre of the drama and pressure around this, not least the Liberal Democrats, who pretty much are the only party, a big party that can remain, who can challenge the government unfettered on the issue of Donald Trump's foreign war. They're sounding the alarm today. They're picking up on the rhetoric of Donald Trump and Defence Secretary Hexketh, who was talking increasingly about a war without limits. And the Lib Dems want to know about the bombing of civilian and ecological sites, including in Iran and part of Iranian territory. And they say that the fact that US bombers, the B-1 bombers, each capable of carrying 24 cruise missiles, have landed at RAF Fairford, meaning that there are questions for this government to answer.
Yes, Ed Davies' party reprising its role from the Iraq War of the early 2000s, taking this to Parliament and asking the awkward questions, which across the party landscape for a number of reasons are often being dodged here. They say they need answers from the government on what exactly it has authorised the US to do regarding planes leaving UK bases and how it will ensure that these don't commit war crimes by hitting civilian infrastructure. And they could well be applying for an emergency debate on the limits and monitoring of the government's consent for the US use of UK bases, where the devil is, to give the Lib Dems credit here, the devil is very much in the detail of what is scoped in and out of these arrangements.
There was also a call between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump yesterday. If you remember, on Friday, there was yet another Truth Social post attacking Keir Starmer's government for offering help after, to quote Trump, we'd won the war. So yesterday, the pair spoke. 20 minutes of duration for the call we hear. Presumably, Keir Starmer on the UK side wanting to mend fences by pointing out the help that the UK is now given. Well, what else did they talk about? Well, we don't know. And I'm quite struck that the readouts of these calls, after getting shorter and shorter, are now non-existent. When you finally got a leaked description of what happened last weekend, it sounded like the president was just bawling out the British Prime Minister. So maybe that's the main reason for that. So as we wait to find out the specifics, just what's your read on the special relationship right now? How does it seem to be shaking down?
I must say, it's such a good point on the readouts. And one can imagine there are lots of invective that you won't necessarily want to put into a communique. But even getting to a call will be something of a relief, I think, because while Keir Starmer has been basking in support in a lot of quarters in his party for standing up to Donald Trump, life in the crossfire is not pleasant when it comes to being on the sharp end of Donald Trump's ire. And it's also picked up by foes as a stick to beat the Prime Minister with, isn't it? You could always say he's weak if you've got the American president saying you're no Churchill and the like. There is, to my mind, a defense of where the Prime Minister has ended up, which is that it is very reasonable to have doubts about the opaque strategy of the Trump administration in this war. And indeed, what you pointed us to at the top of the podcast maybe underlines that you're going to have absolutely dramatic and drastic impacts from the price of oil rising and everything that flows from that. And then Donald Trump saying, oh, don't worry, it'll be worth it once we've brought the Ayatollah, the new one, to heel. I mean, that just seems like an extraordinary argument to have to follow in order to make sure that Britain gets something out of being committed to this. And the rudeness from Washington, etc. It's unveiled an ugly truth that this is a one-way street in favours often when it comes to this administration. So I would say on the whole, it's probably turned out reasonably well. But there is that question of what exactly Keir Starmer has agreed to, and will Donald Trump be happy enough with that, Sam, for it to turn out to be one of those grumbling acquiescences? It does leave the Prime Minister having to say words like national interest again and again without really telling us what our national interest is in this mission?
I suspect that they're perfectly comfortable where they are right now in Downing Street. Donald Trump just seems to have a rotating naughty step. There are always certain leaders on it, and we happen to be occupying that step at the moment, but it does change apparently without consequence. I draw this line of distinction. I think so long as it's all rhetorical, I don't think that the consequences domestically are particularly big. If the UK ends up paying a higher price than some other countries economically, if we end up suffering more in future trade wars with the US, I think that is where questions about whether or not Keir Starmer undermined the special relationship really kick in. And so long as just verbal volleys rather than economic volleys are being hurled, that is probably something that Keir Starmer not only can withstand, but might actually just help him, as you say, for the reasons that you set out. Keir Starmer's out and about in a community centre this morning, and he's released overnight, saying no matter what the headwinds, supporting working people and their families with the cost of living is always top of my mind, as it was with Liz Truss in 2022, but that proved too expensive for the bond market. But narrowly, Anne, in terms of Labour politics, which so much of the present moment boils down to when it comes to Keir Starmer's future, where does all of this leave him?
Well, one saucy detail that I did pick up for our playbook today that caught my eye is that Tony Blair, it's that man again, a lightning rod for a lot of Labour antipathy right now about his comments. They were off the record comments, but leaked into the press, saying that Keir Starmer should have been more supportive of the American assault on Iran from the start. He has been having a nice time out and about socially at Rupert Murdoch's 95th birthday event in New York yesterday, alongside Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. So in the heart of the Trump glossy posse. And of course, he's on that board of peace put together by Kushner as that envoy to Israel, plays a huge role in the administration's dealing with Israel on behalf of the president. I would just suggest that the proximity to Rupert Murdoch and the Trumps is, whatever TB is for, Labour is now against. And this would be a very good example. And a black tie outing at the Grill in Manhattan is all very Succession, isn't it?
It is. I think that Tony Blair's often treated like a sort of guru for the Labour Party. But the bottom line is that some of the stuff he does is just damn unhelpful. And if he is going to argue that he was making confidential remarks on Friday at basically a newspaper in front of journalists and a big audience, then I think that's a bit for the bird. So if you're going to criticise Starmer in private, you might as well do it in public and sort of have, as it were, the guts to do it on the record, because it's not surprising that those comments were leaked to the rest of the media. Right, we ought to do some other political news quite quickly in the remaining few minutes, so you are armed for the day ahead. The Courts Bill is facing its second reading in the Commons tomorrow. That's obviously something I've been following because it's in part scales back the right to jury trials. The big question, how big is the rebellion? Well, I've discovered that we might not actually find out. If you remember, a second reading vote is about the principles of the bill, and the principle of the bill is to cut the backlog. So I'm told that the main plan under consideration is that the rebels may now abstain, and that way keep the government guessing about its strength, and then they'll try to seek changes further down the track. Now, rebels will say that's because they want to keep their powder dry. Critics of the rebels will say, well, maybe you just don't have the numbers. But there are more discussions between the rebels and the government later today. So I think it'll come down a bit to the wire. Let's see what they do tomorrow.
The government is also publishing its extremism strategy, or new social cohesion strategy, as it has been more positively renamed and marketed. What we know so far, well, the trail overnight, including a new confidential whistleblowing service for university staff to raise concerns about activities on campus, new powers for the Charity Commission to shut down dodgy organisations, and the publication of a state of extremism report. Playbook has the wording on that. It's quite carefully worded, I think, to make sure that it sort of lands reasonably straight down the middle in terms of trying to avoid one side or the other saying that the language is too skewed. But there's also the creation, and here you can really hear the language doing a lot of hard work, Sam, is an anti-Muslim hostility czar. Right, so that's definitely a new definition of Islamophobia, but out seems to go that term as per the leak of the plans. The government also trying to make the progressive case for the need to learn English, and ministers will launch a review of language position rather than introducing new compulsions. That's a bit of a step back, I think, from some of the briefing about what Shabana Mahmood initially had in mind. The Guardian is reporting that.
Yeah, this area is so hard. You've got to feel for the officials landed with sorting out the fine detail of all of that. Just to take one detail, you mentioned the confidential whistleblowing element of all of this. I recall that when it came to grooming gangs, people were scared to say something in case they were accused of being racist. So I suppose the question is, does such a confidential hotline of the sorts that you outline actually come around, sort of get around that problem? All of that will actually come down, I think, to the implementation, not to what we hear today. So some problems slightly kicked down the road. I think the main thing is that there's no one big thing you can do to solve social cohesion problems or to tackle extremism. So you're sort of infinitely playing whack-a-mole with this stuff. It'll be the kind of report that there's lots for people to attack in, I think, when it comes. But most of all, I think that definition of Islamophobia is the thing that people probably end the day arguing about.
Yeah, it's kind of clumsy, isn't it? You have to imagine Nigel Farage and co having great fun with that naming or renaming. On a related topic, there is a fascinating scoop in Playbook worth taking a look at the detail of this. But it's basically judges here in the UK ordering the Home Secretary to reconsider a decision to block the return to Britain of a severely disabled woman who is detained in a Syria refugee camp with her young son. It turns out to be the second time that the government is found to have acted unlawfully in this case. Now, Britain, as we know, has been pretty resolute in preventing people who went to live under the ISIS cult from coming back to the country. Everyone knows about the Shamima Begum case. This one is less well known, but it could, I think, become so. Just in a nutshell, Sam, this is a mother in her 40s who went to Syria a decade ago with her husband, who's now presumed dead. She is cared for by a very young son, 10-year-old, after an airstrike left her paralyzed. And the Home Office has advised that there are exceptional, compassionate and compelling circumstances to grant her re-entry to Britain, and that the threat, according to expert witnesses, is minimal. The government to date, however, has said no, and these things do have a habit of becoming a talking point that's worth taking a look at. It's just another big headache, isn't it, for Shabana Mahmood?
Right, let's see where that goes. Okay, we will be back tomorrow for Politics at Salmon on Tuesday, quite where all the economic fallout goes. I think will be the biggest political story of the day, but we will see you again tomorrow.
See you tomorrow morning.